Hello everybody and welcome. I'm Emma Griffin, I'm the President of the Royal Historical Society, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome so many of you to today's training session on getting your first article published. Before we begin, I've got a little bit of housekeeping to run through. First, I'd like to remind everybody that this event has subtitles and you're able to switch that function on or off by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button, which is at the bottom band of the Zoom screen on the right-hand side, according to your preference, whether you prefer to see them or not. A reminder too that this event is being recorded, so if you're unable to stay for the duration, or if you just want to check back later on anything that you've heard today, you'll be able to find the recording through the RHS website in the very near future. If you need to raise any issues during the event, please use the chat function and a member of the RHS team will be on hand to help you. So, as many of you know, the Royal Historical Society is the UK's learned society for the discipline of history. We support historians across many different facets of their work, both inside and outside universities. And one part of that work is supporting students and new entrants to the profession. Today's workshop is part of a really long-standing tradition of training events that the RHS runs, and we'd like to establish these on a more regular basis. So we're also hoping to get some feedback from you today in order to find out a little bit more about what kind of activities and events you would find useful and helpful. So you'll notice that we've set up a poll to find out more about who's here in the room today. There we go, that's just popping up. I'm going to minimise it. And that's the other interactive elements coming up later, and they're completely optional. You're not obliged to engage with them at all, but they're for our purposes and hopefully of your long-term benefit as well. So we've divided our event into two sections, and we're going to run up to the first hour with this session where journal editors will be talking about what they're looking for when they're considering articles for publication. In this first half, I'm joined by three academics with experience of actually having edited journals. Sandra Denotta, who's got up rather early this morning to join us all the way from Canada, where she teaches at Queen's University. She works on modern British history and is one of the current editors of the Journal of British Studies. There we go, popping up on your screen for you. It's a very high impact journal, and I would imagine it's given her a lot of experience of seeing journal articles all the way through from submission to publication. I'm also joined by Rebecca Lee. She's currently at Goldsmiths in London, and she's moving to Oxford University in January 2022. There she is, smiling at us. She sits on the council of the RHS, and she's also one of the editors of the Journal of Southern African Studies. So that's a journal with a very strong interdisciplinary focus, but it's also a journal that sets a lot of history articles as well. So she's kind of an interdisciplinary perspective to bring to the table today. And the final member of the first hour's panel is Professor Jane Winters. So she's a Professor of Digital Humanities at London University School of Advanced Study. There she is. She's the current Vice President of Publications at the RHS. She's also a former editor of historical research, and she brings a special expertise in open access publishing. So we're going to all take it in turns to lead a slightly different part of the conversation for this first hour. I should also say that I'm also finishing a 4-year term as an editor of historical journal. So I'm here today speaking as an editor rather than as a representative of the RHS and sharing my experiences of that role. So let's get started. We're all going to say something about article publishing, and in the second part of this hour, we'll be devoted to taking questions from you. And you may have questions that arise as we're speaking. I'd encourage you to use the question and answer function here on Zoom rather than the chat. It's a little bit less distracting, and it's easier for us to pick up the questions that people are asking. So do get using the Q&A as soon as questions arise to you. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about where to begin. Where do we begin with this task of trying to write something for publication in a journal? So at some point during or after a PhD, it becomes clear that you have a lot of material, plenty of material, and you have enough to start thinking about getting published. And for many of us working as historians, publishing a book is the priority. It's a long-term goal for many, and it is clearly very kind of fundamental to our discipline that we publish our work in book form. But breaking research into smaller chunks that can be published as an article is also a really important and really helpful part of the research process. And that's what we're going to focus on today. I should also say that at the beginning of my career, I was really bad at doing this. It took me a long time to really grasp how important it is to try and write journal articles in addition to focusing on trying to finish the book. I ended up publishing, I had a very kind of unbalanced CV by the time I was 7 or 8 years into my career, with much more in book form and much less on journal article forms. But journals are where the conversations about your research happens, and people engage much more. People do engage more with the work that you put out in journal articles, and it's also a very good way of telling the scholarly community that you're there and that you're coming and that you've got more, you will be having more to say. So it's a really, really important way of kind of putting your marker out there and letting people know what you're doing. In my own case, I think part of the reason I wasn't writing a lot of journal articles is because I sensed there wasn't an awful lot of conversation around what I was working on. And I think with hindsight, that's a big red flag right there. If there's not lots of conversation happening that would make sense to publish as a journal, that probably says something about the bigger topic that you're working on as well. Because what we want as historians is really to be part of the conversation, and being able to engage with debates in journals is a good kind of sign, a good indicator that you're working in a field that is of interest and where there's discussion and debate going on at the moment. So one of the first things we've got to do is try to decide where conversations are happening in our field. But I think there's still a second question that comes very quickly on that, and that is, how do we take a big long form piece of work like a PhD and decide which part of that body of work is the part that we're going to break down and put into a journal article? And that can be a very difficult kind of task, working out, you've got an abundance of riches when you've done a PhD. Working out which is the bit that's going to work as an article is really is far from straightforward and far from evident. I should also say, of course, you work with supervisors. So these should be conversations that's kind of ongoing with supervisors and others in your department who should be able to kind of provide advice on these kinds of things. Well, as we look at our work and we try and decide which is the bit that we might publish as an article, from a researcher's point of view, it can be very tempting to focus on the bit where we found the really interesting sources, or the really inaccessible sources, or the bit of the archive that nobody's been in today, that nobody's been into previously, that bit that nobody else has really got hold of. And it may seem important to us, that the journey that we had to go through in order to get this research out into the air, but from the point of view of the journal editors and their readers, that story about how you got the research is not the thing that's of great interest. They really, as editors, we're really kind of turning it around the other way. And it's not about how you got to the point that you got to, and how you found these sources and how difficult it was and how arduous it was. The question for us is how relevant it is to other people who are working in broadly cognate areas. So the question is about relevance and how you're going to make an intervention rather than, think about, but how you're going to kind of intervene in this debate. It's very helpful to think in terms of an intervention as well as in terms of a conversation. So we're trying to take part in a conversation that's out there, but we're also particularly focused on intervening in those debates in some kind of way. And we've got to find our point of intervention, the point that's relevant to us. So to take an example with a student I'm working with at the moment, working on nursing in the First World War. That as a topic is too broad to be obviously kind of relevant, and we're not going to be able to kind of write an article that's simply on nursing in World War I. And the task there is to think about what other debates, what other scholars might we be able to speak to who'll be interested in nursing in World War I, which in itself is small and niche. And all of our research, when you get into the archives, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's about kind of going from that small micro piece of research that we've done to speaking to bigger debates. So if this particular example, we might think about the longer term history of nursing. There might be a bigger story about nursing over a century or something, where this will be a particularly useful case study that we could develop further. It might be that we want to contribute to debates about World War I. It might be that we're thinking that we start from the observation that nurses themselves are part of the kind of the military apparatus of the war. They've been written out mostly of histories of wartime and of warfare, and that we can kind of improve our understanding of the world of combat life by bringing in frontline nurses. It might be that that's the place that we want to kind of bring in. That's the way that we want to intervene. It could be about women in the early 20th century. We could be thinking that these are working women earning a salary, that there's a history of women's work, and we could use our niche example there to speak out to these bigger debates. The goal really is to connect the close work that you will have done in libraries and archives with some bigger and broader audience that doesn't have the same level of precise detail and interest in the things that you're working on. As an editor, you do find yourself saying the same things over and over again as you look at submissions. And the thing that I find myself saying more than anything else is not about the quality of the research. Over and over again, it's really painstaking research. It's really careful. It's right. It's true. I have no real criticisms there. But it's about whether it's going to work for a journal like Historical Journal, where you want to talk to a big, broad audience who just don't have that narrow focus. All journals have a bigger audience than the piece of work that you're focusing on. So it's really about kind of bringing out the relevance, and that's I suppose that's the first thing that I want to kind of add to the debate. Why don't I stop there and see first of all if any of my co-panelists have got anything they'd like to add. Brilliant, Sandra, go ahead.
Oh, I was just poised to give my comments, so I wouldn't be searching for the unmute button.
Right. Anyone else? Or we'll go straight to Sandra if that's the case. To Sandra.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to join the discussion today. As Professor Griffith mentioned, I'm co-editor with my colleague Geoffrey Collins of the Journal of British Studies. And the Journal of British Studies is a Cambridge University Press journal. It's affiliated with the North American Conference of British Studies, with very, very strong links to the UK. A little more than 35% of the journal's editors are affiliated with UK institutions. And we're also very dependent upon reviewers at UK universities for submission. So we have some strong connections. So building on the initial insightful reflections, I'd like to consider the question of how you as an author select the journal for your first article. And here I'd just really like to underscore Emma's comments about the reasons for publication, absolutely critical also to journal selection. So you're communicating your research and you're advancing knowledge. You're establishing an achievement and contribution to your field for the purpose too of applying to grants, employment, tenure, promotion. You might also be establishing your presence in a subfield or advertising or promoting your work on a given topic. Or you may be wanting to contribute to an understanding of a current dilemma or problem in society or politics and looking to reach a very wide readership or wide audience, potentially through a non-peer reviewed publication. I'm going to focus my comments here on the peer-reviewed publications, but it's really important to keep this category of non-peer reviewed, broad impact writing as historians as well. Throughout our careers. So as you begin to think about publication, I think I would just start by saying, get to know the larger landscape of journals in your field. Which journals will best enable you to enter the conversation in your field that Emma highlighted initially? You can do this partly by dipping into the web pages of the journals, that you yourself find helpful for your own research. These journal sites provide information about the overarching mandate or aims of the journal, and they might signal openness to new methodological approaches that particularly suits your research, or a preference for certain kinds of research. If you dip into the table of contents of recent issues of the journal, you'll develop a sense of the tone of the journal too. You can sample articles to become more familiar with this tone. I'd really recommend too speaking with your supervisor, with advisors, to mentors you might have, to people in your cohort or colleagues who have already published initially, to get their experience and their advice as well. It's also really important to know the style guidelines and length limits of the journal that you're selecting. Most historical journals run articles between 8,000 to 12,000 words, but there's a great deal of variety. So ensure you know this in advance. Pieces that are longer than the upper limit will likely simply be turned back to you and won't go out for review without cutting down the length. The other thing I'd suggest at the outset in identifying or selecting a journal is to think about the audience. And this goes back to the question, to the point about an article being a conversation. So it would be good to seek to place your article in a journal in which you know that you'll be joining a conversation or contributing to a conversation. It could be in a more specialist journal in your field. I'm thinking like maybe the Journal of Intellectual History or 20th Century Britain that looks at thematic or chronological approaches specifically within a time frame, or not that 20th Century Britain is a chronological approach, but it's setting aside a specific time frame. Or you could look at a more generalist journal like the Historical Journal, Journal of British Studies, American Historical Review, or those that might feature cognate disciplines or specific methodological approaches. I'm thinking of representations here. And that choice is connected in part to your desired audience. What readers might you anticipate? With whom would you most like to engage? What is the best fit between these historical questions or problems that you're interrogating and the journal in question? And I don't want to emphasize too much this contrast between a specialist journal and a more generalist journal, because even an article that deals with a quite narrow subject and is a deep archival dive into that subject can be of great generalist interest if it appropriately sketches out the big questions and big problems for a more general reader. So in the Journal of British Studies, we do publish highly specialized articles, but we really ensure that those articles sketch out the context and provide a really clear summation of what the key questions in the field are that might be otherwise assumed in another venue. I think it's also really important to consider the quality of the journal. And my advice would be to aim for the best possible journal and aim for quality versus quantity of publications. And I would, and there may be other comments at the end of this panel on this question, but I would suggest caution in considering very minor journals that might not have a broad audience. And this is partly because you'll likely want to publish your research as a monograph. So it's important not to publish in article form too much of the thesis or of your monograph material. Academic presses may wish to limit authors to 2 research articles to ensure the newness or freshness of the book's material. Another device is to choose an element of your research that you know won't appear in the monograph for separate publication. But I think the principle of quality over quantity still stands. In aiming high, you may receive a reject on your first try, but potentially you'll also receive a revise and resubmit and extremely valuable reports from reviewers that will be so beneficial for the development of this submission, but also for your historical scholarship more broadly. So revise and resubmit is a very good response from a strong journal, and you should take up the offer for revise and resubmit in most cases. I won't go into a lot of detail about how to determine the quality of a journal, except to warn you against predatory journals, which you may already have received emails inviting you to publish with them. And these journals may solicit publications promising a quick turnaround, but be wary. In addition to fee requirement, there's no peer review or professional editing, and you may not reach the audience you intend to reach, in part because a journal will lack credibility, and neither will the publication help advance your career. So it really goes back to that principle in the introductory comments this morning about joining a conversation. You can easily find lists of predatory journals, but some quick signs to look for is who's on the editorial board. Do you recognize their names? Are they respected scholars? Is there an explicit process for peer review? And are there fees for publication involved? And in contrast, quality journals are generally published with reputed academic or respected trade presses. Look at the editorial and advisory boards too, and see who's on there. They also publish impact metrics. And it goes again to the point of connection to conversation, because quality journals are carried by major library consortia so that scholars across the world can access them. So it's a question of access as well. So some other elements to consider briefly when selecting the journals. You may want to consider if a journal has a very long pipeline of articles, which may mean that your article, once accepted, will take a long time to come out. You can clarify that by a simple note to the editorial team for clarification. This matters a little less nowadays because journals are increasingly able to share articles that won't appear in print swiftly via approaches like first view or advanced articles. And I think this is really important for early career researchers who want to get that conversation and dialogue started with their colleagues, or who may be applying for fellowships or academic positions or other non-academic positions. You might also consider what the journal's approach to open access is. I won't go into detail about this because it will be addressed later in the panel, but it's a question to consider, especially if your funding organization has requirements for open access. You might also consider impact metrics of the journal. This data is available on journal websites. It can give you insight into how frequently journal articles are downloaded and cited. And this goes back to the question of thinking about your audience and starting that conversation. So once you've narrowed your list to a few journals, familiarize yourself and begin to position your argument against other works on the same subject. And you might be very attentive to whether the journal has published similar pieces. And if it has, then either consider another journal or be very careful to indicate how your submission adds to the conversation. If there's too much similarity, the article may receive a desk reject by the editors. We do this at the Journal of British Studies, and then it's not sent out for review by external readers. We do provide authors with initial thoughts on the piece if we do a desk reject, but it doesn't go out to full review. So, and write and revise your pieces with your audience in mind. And I would really echo the importance of making sure that you're very clear in your writing about how you're contributing to a conversation, how you're changing the dialogue, how you're advancing knowledge. It's one of the most common responses too that I send out to submissions, and it is often reflected in our peer review reports that the piece doesn't have a strong enough analytical arc that really sets out a set of questions, outlines what's at stake in the exploration of the problem, maybe doesn't really critically position the work in light of existing scholarship. This is very, very important. Do you appropriately cite other scholars? It's important to keep this in mind since potential reviewers of your submission may have published on your topic. If there's a work directly on your topic, it's best not to ignore it in your own submission. So reviewers will often suggest that submissions to the Journal of British Studies insufficiently engage with core literature or explain what is novel about their approach. So just in closing, publishing is like many things in life, a question of serendipity. So it's important not to leap to conclusions about the quality of your life's work if your first approach to a journal is discouraging or does not run smoothly. Everyone has received discouraging news from journals. But persevere, and your work with persistence and with eye to its quality will reach the audiences and join the conversations that in which you'd like to engage. And lastly, if you have any further questions, please do free to email me. I'll pop my email into the chat, and I'd welcome the conversation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sandra. So we're going to turn to Rebecca now, who's going to talk us a bit through more the actual kind of process of submitting and working and refining an article.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. Thank you, panelists, and thank you everyone for joining. I actually wish I had had the benefit of such a workshop when I was a student. It would have saved me a lot of mistakes and headaches along the way. So thanks very much for your time. I guess my remit here is to go behind the scenes a little bit to sort of kind of go behind the veil, I suppose, of the journal publishing process. I will say that, as Emma mentioned, I am part of most of what I will say is from my particular experience on the Journal of Southern African Studies. It is an area studies journal, an interdisciplinary journal, but we do get a very significant number of history submissions. But I think that the processes are broadly similar across disciplines. So there might be a few sort of, different kinds of experiences in this sort of, in terms of the publishing cycle. So I welcome my fellow panelists to bring in their particular experiences, right? So what happens during your engagement with a journal? So I guess once you've identified the journal that you want to publish with, and you've submitted your abstract, your paper, etc., what happens after that, I suppose, is the question. Peer-reviewed journals are peer-reviewed. So what that means is usually there is a sort of editorial board and an advisory board, or a panel of experts chosen from across different relevant fields that are covered by the journal. And your paper will be sent to those experts. In our journal's case, if we can't find the right expert for a very specific topic, then we do, on an exceptional basis, send your paper out to, we solicit reviewers from outside the editorial and advisory board. So essentially what happens is your paper gets assessed by a panel of experts. The number of people who do the peer review also depends from journal to journal. My particular journal sends it out to usually 2 reviewers, sometimes more, but usually at least 2. It's also pretty important at this stage to sort of distinguish between single blind and double blind review processes. You may have heard these terms sort of bandied about. So if a journal undertakes sort of a single blind review process, what that means is that you as the author do not know the identities of the experts who are reviewing your paper, but they will know yours, so that it's blind in one direction. There's also something called double blind review, which means that neither the reviewers nor the author know each other's sort of identities and institutional affiliations. And I probably won't say too much beyond that. There is a debate with respect to early career researchers, which format serves younger scholars better. I know with our journal, we adopted single blind for quite a while in the way, with the rationale that we thought that if we could recognize, by the name and institutional affiliation that a scholar is an early career scholar, we may build, sort of further structures of support in both the review process, but also what happens after the review. But we have since moved to double blind. And so, these things happen. These are questions that are easily answered either on the journal website or a simple, email to the editorial team. And it's an interesting question, and it's something that you may want to just know as when you decide on the journal you'd like to submit to. So what happens after peer review? So what are the sort of range of outcomes that are possible? So first of all, it is important to say that it takes some time for reports to be generated. So I will say a little bit more about the kind of publishing cycle as a whole and the timeline. Often that's the first question that particularly early career authors ask, is how long is this going to take? And my response usually is longer than you expect. And particularly now with the pandemic, we are, many things are getting delayed. So I am having to sort of explain quite frequently to authors that the peer review process is, is being extended because of pandemic impacts. But essentially, what happens is your paper gets sent for peer review. This is an important thing that I think is not really focused on enough is that, at least for our journal, your abstract is really, really important. It's your calling card for reviewers to sort of volunteer themselves to take on your paper. So often I find that junior scholars don't spend enough time with actually getting their abstract quite right. So it's important, particularly in our case, it's an interdisciplinary journal. So your abstract should really highlight what are the conversations, as Emma said at the beginning, what are those larger debates that your paper is tapping into? What is your disciplinary, regional, chronological sort of focus? What is your source base? What are your main arguments? So, kind of the basics should be quite present and clear in the abstract, because that is the thing that is getting circulated around the editorial board, and then experts sort of volunteer to read your paper. So if your abstract sort of misrepresents or doesn't fully represent sort of what it is your paper is about, then you're not getting your paper sent to the best possible person. So I do recommend really thinking about your abstract. In terms of the range of decisions that are possible, again, this changes or there's sort of variations depending on the journal. For our case, there's a spectrum. So I think it's important to think of this as a spectrum rather than a reject and an accept. And it's also important, as my fellow panelists have already said, is to think about this as a relationship, right? So you're having a relationship over the long term with the journal editor, with the journal, with your reviewers. So there is a whole spectrum of possible decisions that go beyond simply complete reject, complete, accept. So the DES reject is the first one, as Sandra already mentioned, and that means that the paper is deemed not good enough even to go to peer review. So I would say that's a conversation you should have with your supervisor. Make sure it's the right fit. Often it's a question of fit. So if you've done the homework in terms of what's the most appropriate journal for your paper, if you've done the homework in terms of getting your abstract kind of right and ready, and if you've got the material and your supervisor and your more senior colleagues have said this is good enough to go, it's probably not very likely you'd get a DES reject. But that is the sort of one extreme of the potential range of options available. There is, on the other side, the accept with minor revisions. I don't think I've ever seen a paper that was accept with no changes whatsoever. Every reader's report will contain, even if it's the most solid, most amazing, most innovative, beautifully written paper, it will need some kinds of corrections or some sorts of additions. So minor revisions, except with minor revisions, is sort of the gold star, the gold standard of what you can be, what you would like to expect. Typically with a lot of junior authors, it is something not exactly like that. It could be more accept with major revisions. And what that will mean is that there's just more work that needs to be done, whether that means reframing the paper or connecting it to those wider debates. Perhaps there's some problems with kind of pinpointing the methodology. Perhaps some arguments need further, kind of elucidation. Perhaps there's a disagreement with some of the claims that are made in the paper. Anyway, so there's a range of things that could fall under major revision. So in that case, what we do with major revisions is that, there are a list of these changes that the reader's reports suggest. You take those changes, you think about them, you work on your paper, you're revising your paper, and to some extent you assess yourself whether or not you can incorporate the suggested revisions. Some readers' reports say conflicting things. Sometimes they don't agree entirely about what needs to be fixed. And so there is a sort of some amount of work that you need to do with the reports themselves. As a handling editor, sometimes in those cases, I help give the steer. So if I can see that the reader's reports say two different things, I can try to kind of, often in my correspondence with the authors, I sort of say, well, you might want to try this, and then you might want to think about that and that in that way. So to sort of try to mediate between the sort of conflicting reports. But obviously that's something that you need to take on board yourself and have a conversation with mentors if you can. And then what you do with that is you take those major revisions, you try to incorporate them. And then if you do decide to return the revised paper, it's really, really, really important to explicitly say in a letter, in an email, exactly how your new paper addressed the concerns brought up in the original reader's report. And you need to be quite directed. I've seen tables. Some people have used Excel tables, but you can just sort of list comment, response, that sort of thing. So it is important to look very much like that you've professionally engaged with these criticisms and tried to do something about them. And again, not to take these things, as Sandra said, not to take these things personally. These are scholarly critiques. So to try to bring these revisions, and explain them with a sort of air of professionalism. Another potential option is reject, but invite a new paper, or this is something that we've introduced in the journal. So it's a paper that we can't commit to going forward with, but we see glimpses of potential. And so there are ways in which we see that this could really potentially be something that we would like to publish, but it has to come back in a very new form. In that case, that's a completely new review process. It would be subject to 2 new readers' reports, et cetera, et cetera. And then the final one is just reject after the peer review. In every single case, apart from the deaths reject, you will have 2 very valuable readers' reports at the minimum that you should use and file away and look on them again and again. And so that is part of, that's just part of the learning process, and these are very valuable. In terms of the publishing cycle, I don't want to actually put a timeline for everyone, because I do think this depends on the journal, and it is something that you should be asking the journal explicitly if you can. For us at JSAS, I think the quickest I've seen a paper published from the point at which it's submitted to the point at which it comes out in a journal is 9 months. But that is a paper with minor revisions from, sort of someone who sent in a very polished paper already. Typically, it'll be a lot longer. For us, it's probably 9 months to a year and a half to 2 years. Something like that, from the point at which you submit the paper to the point at which that paper is, published. As someone else said, I don't remember who, but we have tried to institute a sort of quicker turnaround time by publishing some of the papers online first before it eventually makes it out into print copies. So if that is your situation where you really, really need a paper in the public domain because of promotions or career, or your CV, or you're applying for jobs, and that's something that you can flag to your handling editor, and that should be something. We don't make promises, but it's something that we would definitely keep in mind. In terms of what to expect from a journal and its editors, so in our case, for our journal, we assign each paper a handling editor. I know that's not the case for every single journal, but your handling editor, you would know that person is your handling editor from the beginning, from the point at which you submitted your paper. So that person is your point person in terms of questions about what's happening to my paper, when am I going to get a decision, or what do I do with these readers' reports, or, and that person, once your paper is accepted, is the one that will be going through the production process, the copy editing, and the production process all the way up to publication. Yeah, so I hope that explains some of the behind the scenes. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we're passing on to Jane now to talk us a little bit about the current publishing environment and open access.
Hello, everyone. I'm guessing a lot of you will have heard of open access, but depending on the point you are in your career and what stage you are in thinking about publishing, you may not have done. So I'll try to explain without going into too much detail, because you can very quickly get bogged down in detail of open access. So, and I should say that this is the UK position. The broad principles apply in lots of different countries, but the implementation of open access tends to be very specific to national systems. So this is primarily for the UK. The current position of UK research and innovation is that, quote, the outputs of publicly funded research should be freely accessible and widely available. And that's resulted in a number of mandates which affect journal articles that are published broadly by anyone working in higher education in the UK. Any articles published with funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, or which are eligible for submission to the National Research Excellence Framework, have to meet quite specific open access requirements. The good news is that at the moment, most journals allow you to do that without any difficulty. It should be a relatively seamless process. There are two main routes to open access that are acceptable for those mandates. The first is commonly referred to as green open access, and that just means that a copy of your article must be deposited in an institutional or subject repository within 3 months of acceptance. And that acceptance is a slightly odd framing, because the point of publication is very easy to fix, but the point of acceptance is open to some debate sometimes, I think, but it's generally when you get a letter from the editor, an email from the editor saying, yes, we're happy to accept. Usually, the version of your article that's deposited is what's called the author's accepted manuscript. And that's the version of your article that's been through peer review, but hasn't been edited yet. So there will be a difference between that version and the version that ends up being published. At the moment, this green OA iteration of your article can be embargoed for up to 24 months. So that access to the version published in the subscription journal you've chosen is privileged for a couple of years, which obviously makes the publishers very happy. The second route to open access is called gold open access, and it requires, again, quote, the immediate, permanent and free to access availability of the published version of record on the publisher's website and with a license that permits copying and reuse. Sometimes that immediate open access involves an author fee. You'll see this described as an article processing charge, or APC, but I must stress that this isn't always the case. A key point to remember is that you don't ever have to pay a fee. The green route to open access is absolutely fine and is allowed by the vast majority of journals. If you do want to publish your article gold OA, perhaps because it's very topical and would attract a wide readership, so it's really important to have that final version open immediately, your host institution will have a dedicated open access fund that you may be able to call on depending on demand. I know that this isn't an option if you don't have an institutional affiliation though, and that's one of the clear inequalities in the system, which the Royal Historical Society has been doing work to try and raise awareness of that particular issue, but it is still a problem. When you do get to the point of thinking about where you want to publish, most journals have very good information about their open access policies online. If you're not sure though, there's a really useful online tool which allows you to check their open access compliance status. It's called, slightly oddly, Sherpa Romeo, and I'll put a link into the chat in case you're interested. And you can just enter a journal or publisher name to find out more information about what they offer. And it's very up to date and it's tied to particular funders and their funding mandate. The other thing to be aware of is licensing. Open access articles are published under a suite of licenses called Creative Commons. Rebecca talked about the spectrum of peer review, but there's a spectrum of license types as well, from allowing people to republish your work without any acknowledgement at all, to preventing commercial and other kinds of exploitation. At the moment, it's still acceptable to use a fairly restrictive license, which prevents commercial reuse and any kind of derived work. Do make sure to check the contract that you sign with the publisher for your journal article, as you can query things like license type and check what it is exactly that you're allowed to do with your article in an open access setting. But the reason I said that at the moment a fairly restrictive license is possible is because this is a landscape that's still very much in flux. The specifics of open access in the UK are going to change fairly soon. This is probably not something you want to hear. It's certainly not something that any of us on the panel particularly want to have to engage with at the moment either, but there are going to be some changes coming. UKRI launched a consultation on open access in the winter of 2019 to 20. The results have been significantly delayed, but a report will be issued this summer. And early indications are that licensing and embargo requirements will alter, and the minimum allowable will be much more permissive in terms of what people can do with your work. And that's in keeping with the founding principles of open access. That's likely to mean that for work funded by the UK Research Councils, the author accepted manuscript will have to be published with no embargo under a license that allows commercial and derivative works. There'll be some exceptions, but the bar around that will probably be set quite high. We don't know exactly what that's going to be, but it's something that we need to think about as a discipline. The proportion of research funded by the UK and that affects the whole of higher education in the UK. And unfortunately, the changes are likely to be broadly similar to what comes out of that UKRI report. This is challenging for journal publishers in particular, and it's undoubtedly going to take some time to work through. If previous reports and consultations are anything to go by, this is not going to be a guillotine that comes down the day after the report. There will be time for this to work through and be adopted. In general, though, I'd encourage you not to focus too much on the details of open access implementation, but on the benefits of having your work freely available to readers. We're all readers as well as authors, and the past 18 months have certainly shown the value of being able to access research literature and data openly online when physical libraries were wholly or partially closed. And you can reach a much wider audience than behind a subscription wall. So well-funded and sustainable open access isn't easy, and we're certainly not there yet, but it brings a huge amount of benefits alongside the practical challenges of implementation. For the moment, I think open access is just something additional to be aware of when you're publishing your work, and particularly around some of the specifics of licensing, but it's also a great opportunity.
Brilliant, thank you, Jane. We're already used up the best part of our hour, so I'm going to switch now to some of the questions that come in through the chat. There's two that I thought might make sense to take together. Let's have a look. Here we go. From Jess Kebble, you've discussed narrowing down your list of journals, but where's the best place to start? There's so many journals out there, basically. How do we narrow down? I think that's a great question. And next to that is from Maya. If one is writing about the problem of historical sources, say, for example, in food studies, how do you decide whether to publish in a history journal or in a food studies journal? So I think they're both kind of pushing us to speak to the same thing, which is how do we decide which is the right journal to place our work? Take us for that, Jane.
Just to say, I think this has been mentioned a couple of times, but talk to people, talk to your supervisor. Where would they suggest? Talk to your peers. Have they had good or bad experiences of working with particular journals? And use bibliographic tools to see which journals publish articles in your field, I think. But talking to people is really important. You'll get a steer for where it's best to focus when you're, rather than, as you say, engaging with that enormous list of possible journals and avoiding the predatory ones as well. If you talk to people, you'll get advice that. On the other question, I think it depends on the audience you want to reach and what you're trying to achieve. So in terms of the balance of your CV as well, because you can do both. It's the framing of the article for publication in a food studies venue or in a history venue. The same research can fit in both. So who do you want to speak to? As Emma said at the beginning, where do those conversations go? And that will help you to prioritise where you want to publish first. But you don't have to publish exclusively in one kind of venue. You can balance your CV across both.
Yeah, just to on that point of whether to do sort of a history journal or some other kind of disciplinary or study area. So because I'd sit on an area studies journal, so when I finished my PhD, I think, or in the few years after my PhD, I think I had a history journal article and an area studies journal article. And I do think it's important to balance. It is also about your career prospects as well. So you have to think a little bit about where you think you may be wanting to apply to and what sorts of publications would, is it a, is it an area study center, and in my case, or is it a history department, or is it some other sort of conglomeration that you may be wanting to speak to? So and it's important not to put too much on the first one, because obviously hopefully there'll be more. So if you think about, if I start with the history journal piece, and then what's the next one, and maybe you want to balance that out so that you're talking to a broader range of audiences, but also showing on your CV that you can cover quite a lot of bases. So that's part of the discussion, I think, as well. I'm sure this is something that you could speak to your supervisor or other senior mentors about. And also in terms of what to pick, or which journal to pick. I also tell my postgraduate students, sometimes it's also about, what's your favorite article that you've read that was really, really important or interesting, so also go with your, sort of an affective kind of response as well. What is the one that's been most stimulating and most beneficial for you? And look at what journal that is. And also I would say, if there's a way for you to find out whether that journal supports early career scholars, whether there are early career scholars in the last year, in all the issues that were published last year, whether it's possible to see whether or not early career scholars have made it there, then that will show you a little bit about about the commitment of that journal to support kind of the publication of first-time authors, for example. So I think that's also important. It's part of the sort of background research that you should be doing when you're sort of scoping out journals.
Thanks, Rebecca. We've got a question here from Franziska that's had a lot of votes, so I'm going to skip to this one. How should the first contact with the journal ideally be made? Should you submit? Oh, I want it to be jumping around. I've lost it now. Where's it gone? There we go. Should one submit only an abstract as part of the proposal, or already have the completed paper ready to go? What's the appropriate length for the abstract? Anything more you can say about that first contact that one might make to the journal? Sandra.
Hello, thanks, Emma. Yes, I'm happy to be a bit more specific. I think in the case of the Journal of British Studies, we like to see the full draft of the article, and I actually think it's to your advantage if you submit the entire piece. An abstract may not really engage the editorial review process in a way that's beneficial to you. So submit the entire paper, and the length of the abstract will vary depending on the journal. So just go into the journal's website, find out how that's stipulated. Occasionally we receive emails from authors that say, I have this piece on, and they'll go into greater length. And almost always we'll say, please submit using the editorial manager processes, which is what our journal uses, so that we can see it in full. So that's what I would suggest in response to that question.
Yeah, I fully agree. We really haven't got very much to say at Historical Journal unless we can see the article, and that's really where everything begins. And you don't need to make much in the way of an approach. You can simply go through the submission system. It will be assigned to an editor, and the process will start there. So there doesn't need to be kind of earlier contact. We don't require that in any way. Let's try to squeeze one more question in before we take a break. And this comes from Chara. She says she's got two questions. One is there a time limit to when you should submit articles to journals after you finish your PhD? I fully finished in March, but have not managed to submit an article yet. I'm working on it. Well, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that. Lots of people haven't got an article submitted by the end of their PhD, but I'll let others speak to that as well. And she's also got a question, which I think is very useful, maybe useful to others as well. If you've been invited to submit a journal article as part of a special issue, does that increase your chances of having your article accepted? And my experience actually is, yes, it does. Depending a little bit on the journal, I think that's a good offer, and I would always take that up. But I'll let the others chip in on those questions as well.
Just to agree with what you said, Emma, there absolutely isn't a time limit. Everybody's careers fold out differently. You might find yourself in a position where you're doing a huge amount of teaching when you finish your PhD, or you move out of higher education temporarily or permanently. So people have very different career trajectories and different life events happening, and it absolutely doesn't matter. Publish when you're ready to help you achieve your goals, and sometimes you will want to prioritize, and other times it won't be possible to do that, but there won't be somebody saying, why did it take you 6 months to start thinking about this rather than 3? And yeah, I agree with Emma. If you get invited to contribute, that doesn't guarantee publication, but it means that the people who've invited you, the editors, are aware of your work and think it's valuable, and speaks to the other articles that they want to include in that special.
Great, thanks, Jane. Go on, Rebecca.
Yeah, just a quick response in terms of the timing. So I think it goes with another question. Of someone else asked something about what if your PhD supervisor is not really encouraging you necessarily to publish, and that is okay. So I was in a fairly similar situation, and just managed to have another mentor who was not my PhD supervisor, who just said, I actually think that bit of work that you're doing is really interesting. Have you thought about publishing it? So and then I ended up having that sort of stream of work ending up being my first publications, and that wasn't via my supervisor's intervention at all, which is interesting. So I think you need to sort of not necessarily wait for your supervisor's okay. So obviously be in conversation with them, but that there may be other scholars that you may know better, that may know your work better, depending on your field, who may just say, have you thought about this? And then I would go with that encouragement. I think different supervisors as well, depending on their generation, where they're situated, they may have different understandings of what the publication landscape is, and they may not may not know your situation or the specifics of an early career research scholar now in the UK, and that is a very particular place to be. So I think it's more about whether you yourself feel that you're ready, and you feel that you have some element of your research that is ready to go, and then to find those mentors that may be able to be in dialogue with you about that. And yes, to the special issue, often the special issue editors will be very much in your subject area. So if you're getting an invitation from them, they'll be with you in the process of putting that special issue out for whatever journal it is. So it's useful to have that relationship. It's a very specific one, a particular one. But yeah, if you've got that invitation, then definitely I would follow it up.
Thanks. Now, I would just add as well. Oh, Sandra, you go. Yes.
Oh, just to add on the time factor, if just to echo what Jane and Rebecca have both said, and to connect with another post here, that as time goes by, and if you're not affiliated with the university, that does not preclude you submitting to an academic journal, and we do not treat authors any differently depending on whether they have the academic affiliation. So rest assured on that point.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to add to the question of the supervisor not being supportive. I think it's very difficult to speak to that without knowing what's going on between student and supervisor. And I would expect there to be, I think your response to that would probably fit in with your assessment of your supervisor's judgment generally. If they seem to have very good judgment generally, and they're suggesting they don't work on an article, that might be something we're listening to. And like, it's so dependent on that relationship, it's really hard to comment from the outside. But one thing I would say is it can often be a really slow process. It's really hard, and maybe we haven't emphasized this quite enough, it can be quite hard writing a journal article. Although you've done all of the research and you've got a really good chapter, turning that into something that's going to work for a journal can be quite time consuming business that can just take suck a lot of time out. So there may be some kind of issues there about the amount of time that the supervisor thinks the thing would take that is perhaps making them lukewarm and neutral about it. I don't want to be too negative and say, look, this is really hard work, you never achieve it, because I think obviously it's a great goal to aim for. But I think that, that's probably perhaps where the caution comes from, that it's not that easy, and it can be quite distracting. And it has to fit within all the other commitments that you've got as you're doing your PhD. All right, we've run a tiny bit over the hour, so we're going to take a short break. I do want to just remind everybody that we're providing a load of additional material in addition to this recording. We're putting a blog post up later, so we will try and pick up as many of the questions that are coming in that we don't have a chance to answer. And these questions on the question and answer, they're still sitting there, so we may well be able to come back to them after we've heard from our second panel of speakers after the break. Just to say, between now, we'll take a 5-minute break. So it is 2 minutes past. So we'll come back at about 7 minutes past. And we're putting another one of our polls up. We're trying to get information out of you as to what kind of events you would find useful for the RHS to put on in the future. So no obligation to participate, but do please, if you want to. And likewise, use the Padlet board and use the chat function here to find any feedback that you want to ask. I will see you all in 5 minutes. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. So in our second half of this event, we're going to hear from 3 young early career historians who've had their first article published. We are starting with Sasha Rasmussen, who's just submitted an Oxford DPhil looking at sensory history and modern women in Paris and St. Petersburg, 1900 to 1913. She's going to be followed by Jonah Miller, who's completed his PhD at King's College London and is currently a research fellow at King's College Cambridge, working on gender and local government in early modern Britain. Thank you. And Dia Gupta, who is our current here she comes, our current past present RHS postdoctoral fellow and working on Indian experiences in the Second World War. Great, I'll hand over to you, Sasha.
Hi, everyone. And thanks to everyone who was a panelist in the first half. That was really interesting to hear as well. So now I'm going to tell you really briefly how my publishing experience went. So my article is called Musicians, Students, Listeners, Women in the Conservatoire in Pre-War Paris and St. Petersburg. So it straddles disciplines, it straddles geographic areas, and I had it published earlier this year in Cultural and Social History. The reason why I decided I wanted to publish an article was basically I was looking into postdoc applications and I was getting really anxious about having something on the board. That was my motivation. And my supervisor said, okay, well, if this is taking up a lot of your brain space and you're worried about this, then why don't you just do it? So I had a lot of supervisor support, which was really helpful. I had also just submitted my 3rd year confirmation of status progress report. So I had a chunk of writing, which was in good shape. I was also lucky that it was a section which didn't need a lot of theoretical scaffolding. It was pretty self-contained. It made a concrete point. I think that's really important because in your doctoral thesis, you can do a lot of, you can sort of lead the reader gently by the hand, whereas in an article, it's a bit more, you've got to hit them with the point. And 8,000-ish words is a lot shorter than you think it is. So I had a piece of writing. I thought it was pretty self-contained. I thought it would do the trick. Initially, I was looking at a special issue of, I think, French historical studies because they were doing a special issue on French musical history. And I was like, great, that sounds like me. But then COVID hit and that deadline went out the window. And I'd had a friend who's a couple of years ahead who had recently published in Cultural and Social History, who said he had a really good experience. I was like, okay, well, I'm doing cultural and social history in this piece of work. I have social elements, I have cultural elements. I took a look down the editors list and saw a lot of names of people who I really respect and who I recognized. And I was like, okay, well, this could work. So I went with that. And so I sat with the text for a long time. I really fretted about getting the text right. Which I don't think was sensible. I wouldn't recommend that. I got to the point where I couldn't stand the sight of it anymore, and that's usually when you should send something off. My supervisors, again, were really good. They were like, look, this is close enough, and the reviewers will give you helpful comments. So like it doesn't, I also had another mentor say to me, not everything you write needs to be an A+ first time, which as someone who struggles with perfectionism, I think I needed to hear. Yeah, so get your text in good shape and then send it to the universe, and whatever the reviewers will say will help it. So my process, I think, was remarkably short. I submitted my first draft on the 10th of December, just gone. I had my reviewers' reports back by the 17th of January, which I was really surprised by given the Christmas break. They gave me 2 months to do some revisions, and so I resubmitted the 8th of March and it was accepted the 9th of March. And then it came online first, 31st of March, and print around the 20th of May. So that was when I got the volume and issue number and the page range, so I could start citing it properly, but you could circulate it earlier than that. So I think 6 months from woe to go, which is quite quick. From everything I've heard, but yeah, it was a really great process. My editor was lovely, would highly recommend the journal. Yeah, as the stereotype, the second reviewer was a little bit gruffer But both of them were very generous in their comments, and I found it really helpful, not only for that particular piece of work, but for the thesis chapter that grew out of that section as well. So yeah, I would recommend it. It is a time commitment, but your work will be more solid, and I think it's just good to calm that little voice saying you should publish. I'll just say really quickly that once I had it accepted, I then had an open access panic, where I was like, oh no, my funder doesn't require this to be open access immediately, but should it be, or does it not count if it's not open access? So I had a little panic, and then I emailed the open access specialists at my institutional library, who were incredibly helpful and explained, no, you don't need to do anything. You definitely don't need to pay the £2,000 that they've said the gold edition costs. Don't do that. You submit it to the institutional repository. We check the embargoes. A year and a half later, it will emerge into the world as it should. So yeah, that was my experience. I'll hand over to Jonah, I think, but yeah, happy to answer any questions that you might have afterwards. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha. And I love that. I just say I love that piece of advice about not being too overly perfectionist. At some point, you need to set the baby free out into the world, and it's good to do. Jonah, over to you.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks everyone for coming and participating. I've already learned a lot. Okay, so my article was about stop and search in 17th and 18th century England, and it was published in the History Workshop Journal in 2019. In terms of selecting the material, my thesis was not about stop and search, but I kept finding it in the sources I was working with. So, and I sort of thought, well, there's this evidence of stop and search happening long before most people tend to think about stop and search happening. And I thought that might be of interest to a sort of reasonably broad audience. So I don't know if this is sort of generally advisable, but I think I really chose what journal I wanted to go for before I'd actually written the piece. And I kind of had a sense that this is the right kind of material for this journal. I really like History Workshop Journal. I like a lot of what they publish. They'd previously published pieces which compare policing in past and present, which kind of was one of the things I was looking to do. So I sort of wrote the piece for that journal. I wrote it in a style and with an audience in mind that I thought made sense for History Workshop Journal. After that, my supervisor read it and gave me a lot of very detailed feedback. My supervisor is an editor of a different journal, so I think that helped. And I also got feedback from a group of peers. We had a sort of reading group and we sent around stuff we were working on, and that was really, really helpful as well. I strongly suggest doing that because you just get lots of different perspectives, and it's a kind of preliminary to the reviewers' reports. And I think if I hadn't done that, then the reviewers' reports would have been a lot harsher than they were. Yeah, and then like Sasha, the kind of editorial process for me was reasonably smooth and fairly quick. I think I submitted in November and it came out in the spring issue, which was published in something like May or June. So I don't know what that is, about 7 or 8 months. And again, the reviewers were positive and critical, which I guess is what you want. And as I think Rebecca said earlier, I have repeatedly reread those reviews while thinking about my other work, and it's been really, really helpful. I think to have a kind of established academic thinking in depth about your work with no connection to you, and in this case it was double blind, so not knowing who you are, was just enormously helpful and carries on being helpful. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for that, Jonah. Shall I? Yeah. Are you happy for me to speak now, Emma? I thought that was an incredible panel discussion, and thanks so much, Sasha and Jonah, for sharing your insights. I'd like to talk about one of the articles that I've had published quite recently. I've had two so far, and there's a third one in the pipeline, held up a little bit because of the pandemic. So this was one of the first ones I published, and I think it was Sandra who said in the first panel that sometimes publishing in a journal can be a bit of serendipity. And I think mine kind of happened that way. In 2018, there was this big conference happening at Oxford on global approaches to the Second World War. I'm a literary and cultural historian of the Second World War, focusing on India. So I was very interested, and I applied to present a paper there. The paper got accepted. And after the conference was over, I was invited by the conference presenters to think about publishing a journal article in a special edition that they were going for. And this was with the Journal of War and Culture Studies. I have to confess that at that point I didn't know about this journal, but then I did my research on them and thought that this was a very appropriate sort of channel for my article to be published. Primarily because I thought the journal had a great interdisciplinary focus. It wasn't too literary, it wasn't necessarily only historical. I tend to combine literary approaches with historical approaches, with looking at visual culture. So I really straddle quite a few different areas, and the journal was very forgiving of all of that, happy to go with all of that. Again, to echo Sasha and Jonah, I think we've been lucky. This article of mine didn't take that long to publish. I think I submitted it right after I'd finished my thesis, which was around early 2019. And then it took about 8 months to publication, including peer review, me taking on the changes that the peer reviewers suggested. This was the online publication though. It was the following year that they did the physical sort of print edition. So it was really helpful, firstly, to have that online publication ready to go on my CV. The print one, I was happy to wait for that. That was fine. And I think I'd like to add sort of two perspectives on top of what Sasha and Jonah have shared here in terms of the peer review comments. They were incredibly helpful. So I'm echoing Jonah and Sasha here. Incredibly helpful, incredibly constructive. I felt like they had really engaged with my article and with my thinking behind the article. And also it made me start thinking a bit differently about that bit of my research. So initially I had, presented a conference paper, been accepted for this special edition and submitted a piece of my PhD research. But then I started thinking, has this got more legs? Can I think about this possibly as my next research project? Can I investigate further down these lines? And this was looking at issues of hunger in the Indian home front during the Second World War and trying to read it through the lens of war and violence. So, and I can tell you now that in the couple of years that have gone by, that has increasingly become the next project that I will go on to work on. And I really think it was those peer review comments that made me think how much more deeply I could think about the subject. So I think I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to hear that you've all had such positive experiences and quite speedy turnarounds as well. I think you've all done really well to have gone from submission to decision within about half a year or so. I know we often struggle to manage that at the journal I work with. So there's more questions coming in. I'm going to invite Rebecca and Sandra and Jane to put their cameras back on as well and throw some more questions. And I suggest everybody just either use your hand or just wave your hand. I'll be able to see it according to what you would like to answer. And I like this question. You can vote, by the way. We won't be able to get through all the questions. As I say, we'll try and pick up as many as we can through a blog post afterwards. You can vote on the questions that are there if there's something that you would like to see answered. But just Kevin said, would you recommend writing an article first and then looking for a journal that fits, or finding the journal first and then fitting your article to that? I guess I have strong views on which I think is the best approach, but why don't we see what anybody else in the room has to say first? Takers.
Go on, then I'll bite. I think I would always write the article first and then think about where you want to place it rather than try and shape it for a particular journal, because you don't know whether that particular journal will even accept it. So I would write the article first, and there will be a home for it. There'll be multiple homes where you could place it, but starting with the research, it would be my view.
Great, go on then. And Sasha, you wanted to speak to it as well.
I just had a really small sort of contrasting thought, and that I would be nervous about writing an article with a completely blank mind. Like I would have somewhere, because some of the requirements are quite different, the lengths can be quite different. I would have somewhere in mind, but maybe don't like set your heart on that, and because it may not happen and it may go somewhere else, and great. But yeah, I wouldn't totally write it into the void, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Jonah.
Yeah, just to echo what Sasha just said, I mean, because there are kind of clusters of journals that cater to kind of particular fields. So I think if you kind of are writing with one or a group of those journals in mind, maybe rather than, I mean, what I did was probably kind of crazy and just go for this one particular journal. But I think if it hadn't worked then, there might have been a couple of other places that are kind of close enough that that they might take something that's similarly shaped and presented in that way.
I mean, I actually really like the fact that people have come up with different answers to that question, and I think it's a really good reminder that this is, you know, we're a humanities subject. There are not clear, obvious, definitive answers, and opinions will always differ. My first thought is I would always have a journal in mind, and that's very true. If I'm writing anything now, I always have a very clear sense of the journal in mind. But actually, if I go back to when I was writing my early articles, that's not true. I had the idea that I would just write the article and then look for a home for it. So there's certainly different ways of doing that, and no right answer. It depends what you're dealing with and where you are in your career and what the publication means to you, what's motivating you. I mean, sometimes there is a debate out there in a journal, you know, this debate is already happening in a journal, so you perceive it from the beginning that you're trying to add to that debate that's there, and sometimes there is no debate and it's a completely new intervention. So I guess that all plays in as well. Let's go on to another question from Donna. I finished my PhD 2 years ago, still not published and now not affiliated. Is there any point trying to publish now? Take us on that. Go on, Rebecca.
I mean, that's quite a question. I think someone else asked that question further down the line about affiliate or being non-affiliated, and whether there's a bias against non-affiliated authors. And I mean, I hesitate to say there's no bias at all. I imagine that being unaffiliated completely, in the case of single blind, in the single blind review process, where it's clear who you are and whether or not you have an institutional affiliation, there may be some unconscious bias working there. So that is something to think about, and perhaps as a way to kind of protect yourself from that, you may want to, you know, have your paper submitted into a journal that has a double-blind review process, so that it's not clear at all to the readers whether or not you have an institutional affiliation, and what matters is the paper and the material that's presented. So that's one thing. And then the larger question of, is there any point? I mean, obviously, that's a balancing. It's a question of balance and where you want to go, how much effort do you want to put, what are your resources, whether or not, I think someone else in that list has a similar question. I'm working right now. Is it possible to write an article while I'm working full-time in a different job? And it's not a small amount of work to publish, to write a publishable article, and then also to engage in the entire review, revision, publication, you know, copy editing, you know, page proofs. There's a whole lot of little stages that go on, and that take a lot of commitment and time. So that really depends on this, you know, everyone's particular cost benefit analysis. Will it help you find a job if you publish in a high quality journal? Yes. Can it guarantee you a job? No, not in this, very fraught, employment environment. So there are no guarantees with this. So I guess this is one of those things where you have to just weigh the options, weigh what resources you have some conversations if possible. Try not to keep these really difficult questions to yourself is, I guess, my advice. Try to have them with someone else, even just to bounce off, what are the pros and cons. Certainly none of us are going to say it's a guarantee, that this is your ticket to a job and an institutional affiliation. It will help, but yeah. But there's a lot of investment of your own that you need to be aware of if you do want to go into publishing one of your pieces. So you just have to do it sort of with open eyes, I suppose, and be fully cognizant and prepared. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Dia, go ahead.
I'd just like to briefly add to what Rebecca said. Completely agree, Rebecca. I think it's also worth thinking about where you are in your career stage and what you really want to do. Do you really want an academic career? Is this, because if you don't want one, or you think one isn't working out, then it might not be worth the time investing in publishing in a top-rated journal. You might be better off thinking, can I convert my PhD into a book? Do I want to turn it perhaps into a trade book and have more of a popular readership? There are other avenues as well to getting your work out there and being read. And I think publishing in journals is one type of approach. And it's about weighing up that type of approach with many other types of approaches you could also take. So it's not like the door is shut. It's just a matter of seeing where the other doors are as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dia. I think that's a lovely way of commenting on that. If we go back to this idea of the journals being a conversation, you're talking in journals to people who have got academic careers or on some kind of academic pathway, and you're going to be much less successful at speaking outside that world through journals. So it's impossible to say whether it's worth it. And I think, we're all here in the business of promoting historical scholarship and ideas. So from a reader's point of view, it may well be very worth it that a good article is out there, and we read articles all the time, and when you look up the person you realize they are no longer within the profession, that you still enjoy their article, you're still grateful for its existence in the world. They have this, they occupy a space in the universe, and we're very glad that they do. Whether that means it's worthwhile for a particular individual to move forward, obviously it's really different and unanswerable for us in some ways. So we'll take a few more questions. We can run for another 15 minutes or so. Thank you for this session. I have a question related to publishing in foreign language journals. Is it possible to have a journal article translated and published in another language, or is that something journals frown upon? I would like my journal to reach a non-Anglophone audience. Any thoughts on that one?
Emma, I can just come in and say how we did handle an example like that when I was a journal editor, is that it was an article that had been published in German originally, and they wanted to publish an English language version with us. And we said yes, that was absolutely fine. But I suspect that's going to vary wildly depending on which journal you're dealing with. So that seems to me a really good example of where you should get in touch with someone, the editor or someone in the editorial team, just to see whether they are open to that. Because a translation is an academic work in its own right as well. So it's not exactly the same article. The act of translation means that you're adding something to, and potentially losing things as well. So it's a different piece of work. But in that case, we did allow that. So, but I wouldn't like to say on a blanket basis that journals would do that. I suspect it would differ. I'd be interested to hear what Sandra, if that's ever come up.
Yeah, so I'll just feed in one other question that's come in. Looking at it, because I mean, there's English people wanting to speak in write in foreign languages in the reverse, and somebody else has also asked, what do you have to consider if you want to publish in an English-speaking language journal and you're not a non-native, and you are a non-native speaker? Is it possible to get editing from the journal? So speak to either of those, Sandra.
I can speak to that. So we haven't had the case, Jane, that you mentioned, but we have worked very closely with authors whose first language is not English, and so we we seek really to publish historians who may not be in the sort of Anglophone world because of the rich perspectives that might come out of that. And we do have sufficient editorial supports to assist with that. And so I would encourage you not to discount English-speaking journals. And I think it could be quite helpful if you're able, before submitting the piece, to have it professionally edited as a first pass, because in doing so, you're removing maybe some of the obstacles that the peer reviewers might occasion. But I would not want the language of your research ever to be an obstacle to the wider dissemination of your research.
Thank you, Sandra. Rebecca, but you might have some expertise here too.
Yeah, just a quick one, because yeah, we are an area studies journal, but so we do receive some research articles that are not in English. So we had a recent example of a French, an article written in French, but it is a little bit limited by the sort of the expertise, the language expertise of the advisory board and the editorial board, you know, so we need to have that expertise of, you know, reading in a different, you know, that different language to actually assess the article. But in this case of the French language piece, it was deemed, you know, worthy of publication. And so the journal will be putting in the money to get that professionally translated, right? So, so it is an investment that certain journals are willing to make for the right paper. I wouldn't say that we do it across the board just as a blanket thing. It is something I think you need to specifically ask for. In terms of getting paper, so we also receive a lot of papers from scholars whose first language is not English. And I would say, I would echo Sandra's advice that it would help very much to focus on the substance of the paper if you have that your paper sort of professionally copy edited or professionally edited, at least as a first pass, as Sandra said, first, because what happens is that sometimes readers, whether they consciously think it or not, it is, you know, if they can't get to the essence of your material because of language issues, they may discount the paper entirely, even though there is a valuable material there. So if you can remove those barriers in some way so that the readers can see the sort of inherent value in the paper, then the handling editors on the backside. So I'm willing very much to work on, particularly with junior scholars who are based in the Southern African region, where this has come up sometimes. So I'm very much willing to get into a relationship and a back and forth and a very fine grained kind of going over papers and the edit, you know, to get very much involved in the mechanics of the editing process. But again, I wouldn't say it's a blanket, we're going to do it for everybody and everything. So it is something that you would have to see that particular journal and also, you know, make some inquiries. But certainly there are cases where I can easily cite, you know, both cases that it is possible.
Great, thank you. And I'll just pick up one other one related to that. What difference does it make to publish in a foreign language journal? Is it detrimental? Might be helpful to publish in foreign language journals? And I would just quickly say to that, and that obviously depends very much on the field, but if you're working with foreign language sources and engaging with foreign language historiographies, it's certainly not detrimental to be connecting with audiences in foreign language journals. Very context dependent, but not obviously no. So Christopher has asked, thank you for the talks and advice so far. 2 questions. What are the best options for publishing work that is heavy on graphics or illustrations, and how do journals handle image rights? And also, how common is collaborative authorship by 2 or more, and how do journals handle that? So I thought there's plenty there that people might want to speak to. Go ahead, Sandra.
Yes, these are excellent questions. I think I'll just begin with the second one. I really welcome submissions that have joint authorship or collaborative. And I think that it's wonderful to see humanities scholarship adopting a more collaborative method or approach to scholarship, which has been so long the province of science, technology, engineering, or math subjects. So usually one primary author is identified as the author for correspondence, just for simplicity. And sometimes this is collaboration between the supervisor and a student, but not necessarily. It could be any combination of collaborators. And so then having some broad agreement about the response to suggestions that come from the readers' reports, obviously that would need to be discussed between the collaborators and know how to respond to them. On the question of illustrations, I think that we really welcome in our journal illustrations or charts or complex graphics. The presses are well used to handling material of this sort, and it can really animate the publication. So we see this almost as a virtue. And the licensing for those images, we provide information to the author about how to contact the organization to receive those rights. Occasionally there is a fee attached to purchasing the rights for images. And again, we help authors navigate that. Sometimes funding agencies that may be funding your research will cover that. Occasionally too, we publish pieces that Cambridge University Press has covered the cost of those images. So that's something for discussion with the managing editor about how to proceed on that. And I guess I would just add that that seeking those approvals early in the process is very sensible, because sometimes you don't want to ever hold up the production of a piece because you're waiting on approvals.
Great, thanks. Jane, did I see your hand up?
I just really wanted to endorse what Sandra has said on both of those questions. The co-authorship wasn't particularly common, as Sandra said, in the humanities, but it is increasingly, particularly as more people work on interdisciplinary projects. And it's actually a much more generous way of working if you have been involved in a larger project, to recognise the contribution of everybody involved in that. And I should also say that there's no detriment associated with ref submission for co-authorship either. So don't be worried that that co-authorship doesn't count for as much as single authorship, because there is no difference in how that gets treated. The images side of things, it's probably worth noting that there's a difference sometimes between how images and tables are presented online to presented in the print journal. There are still a lot of print journals which will only publish images in black and white, for example, but that doesn't mean that your digital version can't have a color reproduction. So just because it might not look as good as possible in the print version doesn't mean that you can't include those kinds of images, because they can be published in color online, and potentially you can associate data and other kinds of outputs along with a research article online as well. Negotiating the rights is something that is sometimes a bit of a shock, I think. But it sounds like Sandra's journal and publisher provides a huge amount of support, which is really great to hear, but it isn't always the case. Sometimes journals and publishers will basically say, you have to sign in a contract that you've cleared the rights for everything. Here's some broad generic guidelines about what you might need to do, but it's up to you to sort out the permissions for your images. So that is a bit of a shock the first time it happens. And again, as Sandra said, leave plenty of time to do that, because it will take longer than you think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's always, every journal I've been involved with, it's been on the author to procure the images, get a good high digital resolution, resolution image, and to clear the rights. So that's quite a lot of work. So I think I would also say that at a historical journal, we're very happy to present all sorts of other kind of additional material. But we do always ask that question, first of all, is it necessary? Is it important? Does it justify its place? It's always a bit more expense and bother to go for graphs, tables, images. So we'll always say, is this like just decorative, or is this actually integral, important research that you're presenting? So these other formats certainly have their place, but they can be time consuming for you as an author. So there's a lot of checking all around at the historical journal to check that it makes sense for us and it makes sense for you to do that work as well. Time is marching on, and there's another question here that I think would be great to throw out to people. So from an anonymous attendee, do any of you have advice about how to carve out time during your PhD to work on an article for publication? It feels like there aren't enough hours in the day. Very true. I agree. I think articles take a lot of work. And I'll just also throw out, I think most of the articles that I've ever had published, some of them have taken up to 4 years from starting with the idea and collecting some of the research and having this clear sense of what I wanted to do and being published. I think I've got at least 2 that have taken 4 years to go through various different journals and rejections and revise and resubmits and complete redesigns. They can be, you know, a major undertaking. That's not always the case. Some go much more quickly and much more easily, but it always does take time. And it's a very good question. How do we find the time? And we've got other things to do as well. So panelists.
Thanks for that, Emma. I think the question about having not enough hours in the day never seems to go away. I can't say it's gone away with my PhD. I wish it had. Could have submitted the thesis and submitted that problem at the same time. No. I think, so in practical terms, what I would say is if you feel that the PhD is already quite overwhelming and you're doing lots of work on it, you could carve out an article from the PhD work itself. It doesn't have to be something completely separate. I think some of our panelists mentioned that it's a good idea not to publish too much from your thesis if you're thinking of converting the thesis into a book. And that was very much the advice I got as well. But when the article I spoke to you about, which got published in the Journal of War and Culture Studies, that was very much a part of a thesis chapter. And I have to confess, I didn't do loads of rewriting or reworking to make it fit the journal, that journal in particular. So I think if you're working on your PhD and you're doing writing, you can select about 8,000 words out of say 85,000, 90,000 monster, and think about publishing that. It doesn't have to be something entirely separate.
Sasha.
I would also just say really quickly that I've just finished. I submitted a month ago, and there are different gears in the last sort of year of finishing your PhD. And so I came off the 3rd year confirmation. I had something, I worked on that, and then it wasn't until about May of this year that my supervisors were like, okay, we're gonna finish now. I was like, okay, gear up. And there is also the lull after you submit as well, which might be a good idea to bear in mind. If your focus is finish the PhD, finish the PhD. I would not recommend being in the final sort of 6 weeks and doing an article at the same time. I would not recommend that. And you will have a gap after you submit while you're waiting for the viva, while you're thinking about that. It could be 2 months. Ideal time to take a section and turn it into something and send it off and start that ball rolling. And yeah, schedule in some time to rest as well. But yeah, think about what your main goal is. And if your main goal is to get the PhD in, move the article around that.
Definitely, that is excellent advice. Related to that, we've got a lot of questions saying I've recently done my viva and I'm doing minor corrections. Both my examiners strongly encouraged me to consider looking to publish my thesis. Will the fact that I haven't had journal articles published matter? Should I try to do that first? So I guess we could perhaps close out with this question about balancing between publishing as a journal and working on that book length publication that you might want to be doing as well. Any thoughts from our panel on that? Well, Rebecca, thanks.
I think, like everything we've been saying, there's no single template answer to this question. It's a great question. I would again say it really depends on the conversations you have. Some will say that it's good to get your perhaps one article, at least one article from your potential book out there as a sort of calling card kind of thing, as this is, you know, because it's likely, though not guaranteed, that the journal article timeline, that publishing cycle, will be faster than the publishing cycle for a book manuscript. So it potentially, depending on where you're at, really, because there's also the process of transforming your thesis into a book, which is not necessarily, if that's what your question is, around, it's not necessarily straightforward either. So it's not like your PhD thesis is a ready-made book. It might not be. Some people completely overturn their PhD thesis and it becomes something else in the process, and that may take years. So I would probably say it's not a detriment. It might be an advantage to get that calling card for your research out there in the public domain. So, and that journal article could end up being a reworked first chapter of some sort in your book. And that's certainly allowable. Publishing houses, I think, and I guess this also depends on, you know, countries. So the UK and the US also have slightly different ideas around this, about how much of your work in a book can be in the public domain first before the book comes out. So you probably don't want to overexpose your work, you know, and have every, you know, single chapter of your upcoming book out there already. That's not advisable, because then that decreases, from the publishing house's viewpoint, the value of your book. So it is a bit of a balance, but certainly one article at least, as that kind of calling card to sort of say, this is me and this is my work. You may want to do that, but also keeping in mind that all these trajectories are probably going to take longer than you think. The book publication trajectory and the article publication trajectory. I mean, even though the panelists here have been, you know, incredibly fortunate, but also I'm sure their work was really amazing, which is why they were published so quickly. I would probably say it's not necessarily the example for everyone. It might not be you. You know, I've heard many other stories as well. So to build that into your timeline.
Thanks. Let's go for Sandra and then Jonah.
Thanks. Just very quickly to add to those excellent points, that too, when you apply, when you submit a book proposal to a publisher, they may ask you about have you published this work before? And they're having an article in a strong journal actually speaks to the merits of your submission and your book proposal, because it has passed through a peer review process and has met that grade. So I would consider that as well. And just to echo what Rebecca and Emma both have said, for those journal times that the panelists were fortunate enough to experience are not typical. So if you are in a longer process, don't think that it's something amiss with the quality of your work or anything. Production lines vary so much.
Thanks, Sandra. Jonah.
Yeah, just to add to what Rebecca and Sandra said, I think in terms of kind of juggling timelines, I mean, I'm going through the book, PhD to book process at the moment, and kind of like what Sasha was saying earlier about the PhD, there are periods of lull and then periods of very intense activity, and it might be that in one of those lulls, that would be a time to be working up an article. But obviously there's this whole kind of juggling of timelines, and you can't really predict how long one or the other is going to take. So it's maybe an art rather than a science.
Brilliant, thanks very much indeed. Okay, so we're going to close up in a moment. I just want to pick up on one of the questions I hadn't seen. It's gone up to the top, but it's from Samantha McCormack. Thank you for the excellent advice. Do journals have anything in place to support ECRs with neurodivergence or specific learning difficulties? I wonder how far it's possible to publish a plain language version of work too. I imagine it will vary from journal to journal. I think that will vary from journal to journal, and journals are always happy to hear from potential authors and to respond to those kinds of queries. So I think rather like some of the questions that we've had about translations and publishing in foreign languages, there's always, every journal will have an administrator who will try and deal with every question that comes in, and when they don't know the answer, they'll go looking for the answer from the editorial team or from the publishers. So some of these more specific questions, just feel free to make approaches to journals. Every journal has got structures in place to communicate with authors, and all the journals I've ever worked with, or the majority I've ever worked with, are very interested in publishing work from every corner, and are interested in new approaches and new, open to thinking about whatever new queries that people bring to us. So I'm going to now formally close our event. I'm going to just make a little plug for some other things that the RHS are doing. Draw your attention to the fact that we have our prizes and awards ceremony taking place this Friday. It's a virtual event taking place at 5 o'clock this Friday. And on Friday, the 24th of September, we have Jonathan Sahar giving one of our annual RHS lectures. He's speaking on accumulations and cascades, patterns in the animal history of colonial Myanmar. I'd like to remind you all that the Padlet is going to stay open until tomorrow at 5 o'clock. So do take a moment to contribute there if you are interested to do so. And it just remains for me to say thank you to everybody. Thank you so much to all our speakers for giving up their time and speaking so eloquently on this subject. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for that. Thank you very much to the audience, and thank you all for taking part in our polls, and thank you for your questions. It's really made it an event. We hope very much to see you at an RHS event again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Emma.
Bye.